welcome to our last lecture of the 2018-2019 season for the History Lecture Series. My name is Michelle Miner. I want to welcome you all. Thank you for coming back. We have a really good lecture for you tonight, but before we get started, I have an announcement to make. I'm going to get emotional, so I wrote something so I could read it, okay? I've been involved in the History Lecture Series in some way since 2006, watching Dr. Manning produce the series and serving at the reception. I then went to completely handling the reception for many years while Dr. Manning continued arranging the wonderful speakers to entertain and enlighten all of us attending. In the last 6 years, I've had the responsibility of everything to do with the History Lecture Series, from grant writing and managing purchasing and inventory, arrangement of speakers, mail-outs, the production of the event once a month during the academic year. And I've got to say, it's been a labor of love. Lots of work, but I love doing it because of you guys. I know that my mom spread the news that tonight would be my last night for a History Lecture Series. I am no longer going to produce it. It was a very, very difficult decision for me to come to, but I've got to thank some people, if y'all don't mind. Dr. Manning, of course, for creating this event and giving me such a wonderful footprint to follow. I won't say it was uncomplicated, but he made it easy for me to do. My family, which you have probably all seen at one point or another, my mom, who's in the audience, Melanie, my daughter Audra, who served drinks tonight, my oldest daughter, Kayla, has been here on occasion serving drinks, and of course my granddaughter as well, Elena. They've all been involved in one way or another in the events. And my wonderful partner, Joe, has listened to me time and again complaining about things and worrying about whether or not things were going to go on and helping me in things that happened outside of the school. Ron Chapman has been a wonderful savior when I couldn't find a speaker, when I was running out of ideas. He was also a wonderful mentor and idea person who helped me along the way with advice, and I treasure his friendship, and Curtis's as well. Quinn Banner, who is up in the booth, this last year has been immensely easier because of his production up there, because I used to run up and down the stairs at least 4 times a night, and I no longer do that, which is a wonderful thing. And Mr. Travis Wagispack, who tapes all of this so that you're able to see it on the website. It's a really good, awesome thing that we have with their company to do this. I'm sorry, I'm a little nervous and a little emotional, guys. I was going to say, with all of that said, I will let you know that I'm giving it up, but you all know that already. I got to tell you that this was probably one of the hardest decisions I've made. I love the history. I love coming here and producing this for you guys, and I love the value that it has in the community and for the college. So it was difficult for me to come to the decision to give it up, but I have been assured by Dr. Tenney that this is going to continue, and in September, you'll have your first lecture of next season. I'm leaving it in good hands, so I'm very confident that you'll all will be here again, okay? And I'm going to let Dr. Tenney come up, since I'm so emotional, to introduce our speaker for tonight.
Well, first I want to say thank you for coming to support this History Lecture Series, and I wanted to sincerely thank Michelle Miner, too, for what she described a labor of love since 2006. And Michelle, I know, and we all know, that things like this don't just happen. right? I always say that events don't just happen. So I want to sincerely thank you for the commitment that she's made to ensuring that this series was hosted every first Monday of the month, that we had speakers, that it was a coordinated effort, and her commitment to Nunez is truly, truly appreciated. And, you know, I will say this, in case you did not know, this week is National Teacher Appreciation Week. And so, very fitting on a college campus that we would have several events taking place this week. We have our Excellence in Teaching that's taking place this week, our luncheon. And we're having our final history lecture series for the season. I want to just say that teaching comes in many different forms, and you all know that. So whether you're a faculty member or you're in our student registration, financial aid, testing centers, people teach each other things on this campus every day. And I want to thank Michelle Miner, because she has taught us many things, Michelle. Compassion, coordination, commitment, dedication. And I am very proud to say that she is one of our employees. And I am here to ensure, because I knew this was a very difficult decision for her. So I am here to communicate to everyone that I am committed to ensuring that this will continue. I want to thank Dr. Manning for beginning this series, and it speaks to the academic vigor that we have on this campus. It should live as a community event. We will continue this, and I just have a feeling that Michelle Miner will still be around in a supporting role, and you will see her here throughout the next season. So thank you all for your commitments. Thank you to the excellent faculty that we do have, Dr. Manning and Mr. Ron Chapman, who I now get the pleasure of introducing to you as an excellent faculty member and tonight's guest speaker. So thank you. So we are very privileged to have outstanding faculty here, and certainly tonight is someone who exudes what an exemplary, excellent teacher is in the classroom and outside of the classroom. I consider him not just a coworker, but a dear friend, and so please help me welcome Mr. Ron Chapman, tonight's speaker.
Is this thing on? Yeah, you can take this. I believe I have a lavalier that should work. Is this working? Can y'all hear me? Okay, great. Well, first of all, I have to extend. That helps better? My thanks to Michelle. She has been absolutely amazing throughout all these years. Working with her is a dream. I'm going to miss her, but I agree with Dr. Tinney. We'll get her back somehow. If I got to put her in a bag and drag her up here and surprise her, it'll happen. Tonight's lecture is on yellow fever. I'm not a doctor, but I'm approaching it from a historical perspective. So with that, we'll look at the scourge of yellow fever. Here's our little friend. So few people realize what an impact he had. But that's the Aedes aegypti mosquito, who's responsible for spreading the disease. What I wanted to talk to you about is zoonosis. Zoonosis is the process where diseases leap from one species to the other. And a lot of diseases that we experience are due to domestication of animals. I've taken this map and divided it into quadrants, because here a disease formed called Y. pestis, which worked its way through the Silk Route in the Middle Ages to here and gave us a pleasurable little disease, the Black Death, bubonic plague. Then we have enough, they believe about 3,000 years ago, around Egypt, another little bug came out, smallpox. Smallpox infected the entire European area. And then when colonization took place, colonists brought it across to the New World. Native Americans really domesticated nothing but the dog. They didn't have the exposure to domestic animals and the diseases that you would normally expect. So as a result, they were totally vulnerable. And they estimate that 80% of Native Americans died of smallpox, many before they even met a European. It followed the native trade routes. This quadrant here is where we're talking. Yellow fever, they seem to believe, started several thousand years ago in the monkeys, somewhere in this area of Eastern and Central Africa. So how did it get transmitted? This is the area it's operating out of now, throughout this whole Central Africa. So they believe in Ethiopia, Sudan is basically ground zero for where it was formed. What happened is in the 1400s, the slave trade began. When the slave trade began, Europeans didn't penetrate to the interior. They worked along the coast, and they traded for slaves. They traded a lot of things for slaves, but one of the things they traded was guns. Guns gave the coastal tribes and empires the opportunity to suppress their interior competitors because they had, obviously, an advantage and brought them to the coast. This is the vector, humans, for bringing yellow fever to the coast of Africa. Once they got to the coast, this is an early map showing the factories. These are the slave factories along the coast. So the slaves would be brought to these factories where they'd then be sold. And the slave ships would work their way down the coast, selecting different ones from different factories and then sailing off. This is Goree Island, which was one of the main factories. So the slaves would be brought here. Well, if they had yellow fever from the interior, they'd be bringing it to the coast. And then they'd be loaded up on ships. If you see this, you got, is it 292 slaves. This is a double deck, so you got 2 foot 7 inches between blanks where these people were. And they'd be on this ship, the Middle Passage, for months on end. A lot of the Africans would have been almost immune to it because they'd been exposed to it. As a result, they had immunities. But the people operating the cruise didn't, and if some slaves from other parts of Africa might have it. Plus the water containers that they would fill up might have mosquito larvae in there. So as a consequence, it spread. So that's how yellow fever got out of Central Africa and into the New World. So it arrives. 16th century, it first arrives in the Spanish and South American colonies, Spanish colonies. 1648, the Mayan records in the Yucatan give the first written account that we have of it, that's record. 1668, the first time it appears in New York. It arrives in the mainland, a port. Boston, 91, a port. 99, Charleston, a port. Tonti and 30 immigrants died in Mobile after leaving Haiti and coming over to Mobile. Yellow fever broke out. It was carried in the ship. It was picked up in Haiti. Yellow fever strikes Charleston again. So many people died. They stopped ringing the church bells when people passed. It couldn't keep up with the amount of deaths. 1741, finally the term yellow fever is affixed because of the jaundice that it causes due to liver damage. 47, Philadelphia for the first time starts looking at it and considering maybe it's coming from the West Indies. At this point, we don't have a germ theory, so we have no concept as to what causes it. There's all sorts of ideas. Dr. Valentine Seaman noticed that patients living near a port connected with shipping were the first ones to get it. So gradually, it's coming into focus slowly, that it has something to do with shipping, it has something to do with ports. The connection to slavery takes a little time. William Ferguson, a quantity of green wood recently laid in the coast of Africa in foul ballasting. They called it formites. They thought it was the smell of the air. They thought it was things in the air. Something in the environment was causing yellow fever. Charles Crichton at 85, time and place has dogged the steps of the African slave trade. He's the first one to say, you know what? There seems to be some association with the slave trade and the spread of yellow fever. So what is it? Well, there's 3 flavors. The first is Slavic, which is basically within the jungles of Central Africa itself. It's mostly among the monkeys transferred by mosquitoes, but people who live in that particular area of the jungle can be exposed to it accordingly. But because the populations are small and the people are somewhat isolated, the disease doesn't really break out. We're experiencing something like that right now with Ebola in Africa, where traditionally it's been in rural areas. This is the first time, we better keep an eye on that one, by the way. It's in an urban area with a large population. Intermediate yellow fever, you start spreading among people in smaller communities throughout Africa. And then you have urban yellow fever, Aedes aegypti mosquito, when you have a heavy concentration of people with no immunity and a vector like this, it spreads. And that's our little friend. It's kind of hard to imagine that the greatest predator on Earth, the human species, can be humbled by something that's practically invisible. Lauren, you'd probably understand that more than anybody else. It's always impressed me, you know, that you can't even see it except with a scanning electron microscope. But that is what's caused all the problems. Carried by him. Actually, her. This is some of the headache, red eyes. This is some of the effects you'd have. So if you look at it, you contract it. If you get bit by an Aedes aegypti mosquito who was infected, you probably wouldn't feel anything for 3 to 6 days. And then suddenly you can get fever, chills, headache, back. We call it the flu. That's basically how you would feel. About 15% of the people then would trigger on to the next level. So there are 2 stages to yellow fever. The acute phase, headaches, muscle aches, joint aches, fever, flushing, loss of appetite, shivers, back aches. Basically almost like a flu. It passes, you're okay. Some people, they estimate about 15% though, will go to the next level. 24 hours. The person might recover from the acute stage and actually get up, feel good, bathe, get dressed, start conversations, eating, everything's fine, but within 24 hours, completely collapse and then die. Decreased urination, abdominal pain, vomiting, that's vomito negro, that's the black vomit. It's destroying your liver. It's a hemorrhagic disease. As a consequence, you become jaundiced, and that's why it's called yellow fever. Heart problems, seizures, delirium. You start bleeding from your eyes, your nose, all your orifice, blood starts coming out, and then you die. 15% of the people with yellow fever enter this phase. Most of that number will pass. There's really nothing they could do for it. That's showing you what yellow fever looks like in the eyes. It's jaundice. On the hands. There's a patient in Africa. It's still around. It's not gone by any means. Here's a patient from the 1890s. Case study of the symptoms. Read this. It's brutal, but Lucille died at 10 on Tuesday night after much suffering, as I hope to never witness again. Once or twice my nerve almost failed me, but I managed to stay. The poor girl's screams might be heard for half a square, and at times I had to exert my utmost strength to hold her in bed. Jaundice was marked, the skin being bright yellow hue, her lips dark cracked, and blood oozing from the mouth and nose. To me, the most terrific and terrible and terrifying feature was the black vomit, which I've never before witnessed. By Tuesday, it was black as ink, would be ejected with terrific force. I had my face, hands splattered, but had to stand by and hold her. Well, it's too terrible to write anything more about it. Can you imagine having to go through that with a family member or a child? And it infected everyone indiscriminately. Yellow fever in America. On this map here, you can see it's along the coast and up the Mississippi River. It's following the slave trade. It's following coastal travel to the Indies, because it gets out of the slave trade once it gets endemic into the Indies. If you saw the number of slaves that are going to the Indies, and any ships going to the Indies, Haiti, Cuba, or anywhere, had the potential of bringing yellow fever into port, which is exactly what happened. When it would arrive, these are some of the, I don't know if you can fairly call them cartoons, but some of the editorial sketches that you'd find in newspapers. Yellow Jack. If you've read Rene Hughes' book, I don't know if any of y'all have read it, it's really a good book. You know, its history is a little bit questioned with a couple of points, but he captures the spirit, the feeling of yellow fever, and some of the social reactions to it, because this is a devastating disease, okay? In New York, here's a list of the persons in New York published in 1795 who died, and here you have the governor of Virginia for the first time declaring a quarantine of any ships coming in. They're starting to realize that they're coming in by ship, so they're setting up quarantine stations. The impact was disastrous. family members, fathers, mothers. When a father died or a mother died, it was devastating. So people would reach out, just like we do now, and set up collection boxes, because you had orphans. You had broken families. And you didn't have the social nets you have present today. So these people had to struggle with their own or depend upon their neighbors. So these are the attempts to try to help. Then, of course, there was also the more violent reactions, where a quarantine hospital, people are taking planks and boarding it up so nobody can get out. People are afraid. You find, again, the same thing happening if you're following what's going on in Africa with Ebola. A lot of the same social reactions are much the same there as they were here during the yellow fever epidemics. Yellow fever in 1820, 700 people in Savannah died that year. 1862, Wilmington's population, black and white, was 10,000. Half the population fled the city. That was the other problem. When word got out that yellow fever was about, people panicked and they fled. And when they fled, if they were infected, they could carry it with them to other areas. So that's how it spread further and further and further. Cities were quarantined. New Orleans often faced the fact that nobody would come into the city of New Orleans. In fact, if you sit down and consider it, it's gone now. If you drive along the Gulf Coast, you see casinos. But those of us who remember the Gulf Coast before Camille, anybody up there? Yeah? Remember all the beautiful homes that used to grace? These were people from New Orleans who skipped New Orleans, left, went either to the Gulf Coast or across the lake to Mandeville during the plague season, which is basically from June to October. They closed their houses and they went away for this reason. Yellow Jack in New Orleans, it was caused, they thought, by miasma, bad air. God knows New Orleans had bad air, because you not only had the marsh gases and everything else around, but New Orleans was notorious filthy. I mean, people would take their chamber pots and dump it in front of the house in the gutter. Sewage went in the gutter, or an outhouse in the back. So all these smells were around, and they attributed to that. So as a result, heat, filth, moisture, and these smells, they treated it by shooting cannons in the air to disrupt the air, burning sulfur, burning barrels full of tar, which in a strange way actually kind of worked a little bit, because mosquitoes, you use smoke to keep them away. I don't know if you all remember the St. Bernard Drive-In in Pix. The same moment and trying to get it off the window. So why did we do that? Because it kept the mosquitoes away. So there was a kind of a strange effect, but it wasn't medicinal, but it had that impact. Some suggested quarantine people who had it, but that didn't really catch on. Medicine was in its infancy at this time. There were actually some doctors who thought it was animalcules. You got to go back to Leeuwenhoek with the invention of the microscope, who saw these little bugs run around. Never seen anything like that before, because nobody ever had the opportunity to see it. He called them animalcules. And some doctor said, is it animalcules? They were actually right. It was a virus. But it was something small. The rest of the people didn't believe it, had no idea. They were ridiculed. That's the most ridiculous thing I ever heard in my life. How could something small, it doesn't exist, if I can't see it, it's not there. So that was the attitude. The reputation then soon started getting a reputation as plague city. At certain times of the year, people here left, regardless of whether the disease had broken out. Other people didn't come. Businesses shut down because they knew this city would eventually have an outbreak. And it usually did. Hundreds to often thousands of people would die on a yearly basis. First cases usually would appear in July. You know that. That's when the mosquitoes start getting brutal. August, and then subside when you got to October when the first cold fronts came through. So mosquito population died, so the vector disappeared, so the disease subsided. But they couldn't make that association. They just knew that there were certain periods where the disease broke out. Pestilence really is not safe for habitation. And the problem, if you read into it, the city fathers were so hesitant. If a case of yellow fever broke out, you think nowadays immediately you jump on it. They didn't want word to get out for fear that word would get out. So they kept a cap on it until the population became so infected and so many people had it that there was no longer a chance to hush it up. And then when word got out of the level of devastation, the level of infection, people would flee the city and people would refuse to come in and the economy would start collapsing. It was quarantine. People just quarantined the city. It's a vicious disease. Like I said, the earliest case we know of was right around Mobile in 1704. From estimated records, they figure 41,000 people died of yellow fever. And you realize the populations were a lot smaller then. That number is looms a lot larger. And that's from 1817 to 1905. Citizens fled, people refused to come in, and the social and economic impact of this was absolutely devastating. Support. That was the problem. We still had Port City, we still had tremendous contacts with Central America and South America, and that's the reservoir where it was coming in. The mortality, 12 or 35 years, exceeded 1,000. So 1,000 people a year in many years died. 827, 600 deaths. 1829, 210, 215. But I find it curious, some of the estimates go as high as 5,000. That's a major discrepancy. I had to figure, all right, I'll throw it up there, but I can't fathom why you'd have that much of a difference. However, in the 1830s, you had 4 severe outbreaks, 33 and 35, 1,000 deaths a year. 37 and 39, 1,500 to 2,000 deaths a year. 41 and 43, 1,500 deaths each year. 47, 2,700. And then the big one, 53, 40,000 cases and 9,000 people died. They couldn't find space to bury them. In fact, they recently were doing work on Canal Boulevard, back where, going back to where you passed Lenfins used to be, when they were digging the turnaround for the trolley car, they found piles of bones. It was basically a mass grave for yellow fever victims from 1853. Now they just did was just dig a big hole, dump the bodies in it, pour lime on it, and the priest blessed it, and that was it. There was no chance for funerals, no chance for wakes, no chance for caskets. It was basically like the Middle Ages. Bring out your dead and load them in. This gives you an idea of the deaths. So if you go by, these are the population of the city. So you can realize you lose 2,000 or 3,000 people. In this case, 9,000 people. You're losing a significant portion of your population. But this here shows you the number of deaths, the percentage of people who died. So here you had 50% of all the people who died of yellow fever. Down here, 30%, way up here. The last thing is down here in 1905, which you had 5% death. That's the last experience we had with yellow fever as a plague. The total number of deaths from Saturday to Wednesday was 853, of which 706 were yellow fever in a week. Try to imagine yourself right now in the city of New Orleans losing 9,000 people in a year, losing 800 people in a week. How do you encompass that? How do you deal with that? What's the economic impact? What's the social impact? These are families. These are children. I know my wife's mother, I believe, was it her mother, was one of 7 children. I imagine it must have been the 1905 epidemic. 6 of the 7 children died 1 year. Can you imagine that? You lose your entire family in the most grotesque way possible. Old mortuary chapel built in 1826, Our Lady of Guadalupe, church for victims of yellow fever. Here you have a priest born in Hinds County, Mississippi, died of New Orleans of yellow fever. This gentleman comes into New Orleans, 1822. He stays till 1867. While he's here, he's a minister, and he takes care of people with yellow fever. And he writes this beautiful accord of what life is like for the 35 years he's in New Orleans. But a lot of it he devotes to this. 35 years. 20 fatal epidemics in 35 years. Mostly yellow fever and cholera, which was another one. 2 epidemics of cholera and 2 epidemics of yellow fever carried off 10,000 people. 10,000. He reported the worst yellow fever epidemics. He was here in 1837 with 5,000 deaths in 8 weeks, and in 53 with 9,000 plus deaths in about 12 weeks. Totally destructive to family and the numbers of orphans. This is what he had to contend with as a minister. These are the people, they turn to their ministers, they turn to their churches for help. And he had to try to elicit as much help as he possibly could, not only to help them with food and supplies, whatever they might need, but visiting the sick himself, which is what he did, and trying to take care of those who were ill. His description: the heat of a patient in the early stage is usually very great, but it falls towards the close of the disease, both in convalescent and in the dying stages. But among the dead, in many cases, it rises higher than life, from a quarter of an hour to 6 or 7 hours after death, rising sometimes to 113 degrees. I don't know. I'd love to know how that's possible. But he's standing there. He's measuring it with the doctors. In New Orleans, the instances have been numerous of patients rising from bed, putting on their apparel, and engaging in conversation about their business and plans for the future, and but a few hours or even a few minutes before death, then they collapse dead. So you'd think you're getting better, and you're not. This is the 1853 epidemic. It arrived earlier than normal. It arrived in May. July, 288 died. It spread, struck the poor first, but soon, respectable portion of our people. It spread everywhere. 1,300 had died by July. Our streets are deserted. Gloom, silence, desolation overspread the city. That's the New Orleans Bee newspaper. By August, 4,700 had died. Interesting, it was an unusually wet summer. Mosquito breeding. Between May and October, 9,000 total deaths. So this is what the city had to contend with on a regular basis. It spreads. 1/3 the population left the city. They carried the disease with them. Town of Washington, 100 died. Shreveport, Northwest, and Lake Providence had outbreaks from people who fled New Orleans and brought the disease with them. City of Trinity, Waterproof, and other small towns were practically abandoned because when a case broke out, people panicked and ran wherever they could. They just wanted to get away. It spread along throughout all the river systems and all the waterways. Because patients were carrying it. Another outbreak in 54 killed 2,500, 58, 4,800, 56. But then all of a sudden it dropped down to 100. This is what was so perplexing. There was made no rhyme or reason what was happening or how it was happening. It was total confusion and lack of understanding. The search for a cure. Doctors were completely confused. Yellow fever confounded them for years. City's cultural diversity contributed to that. We had French doctors, Spanish doctors, Haitian doctors, Cuban doctors, English doctors, medicine men from Indian tribes. Everybody had an idea of what to do, but none of them really knew what was going on or completely comprehended it. The Howard Association was formed to try to come to the root of what was going on for health care around here. And they wrote, there were several theories in vogue during the present epidemic, but they're the old ones revamped with little revision and no amendment, or physicians have allowed themselves to be tossed upon every theory floated before them. They were scrambling. Every epidemic initiates a new theory, which experience explodes. Cures, left with traditional cures. Bleeding, imagine that. Bleeding is just basically opening up a vein and taking out a pint of blood. I don't know if you know the story. That's what killed George Washington. You all aware of that? He didn't listen to his wife. He stayed out in the fields, came in soaking wet and cold. She told him, George, dry off. Come and eat. I don't have to dry off, Martha. I'm fine. He got sick. They bled him 3 times, bled him to death, and he died. Should listen to the lady. But anyway, this is the second story. So bleeding, blistering, purging, calomel, and opium. I guess it made you feel better. Some cures administered is extreme that one patient said, a fine demonstration of man over medicine. The patient survived. Some of the things they did were just so outlandish. It's like, you actually survived that? Then I think about chemotherapy, radiation, maybe. We may look back at this and go, really? Y'all did that? Some advanced notion of hydropathy, water. Put you in hot water, then put you in cold water, then put cold compresses, then hot compresses. Put minerals in the water. Water therapy. They were trying anything. Minimal. Some doctors said, leave them alone. Just leave them alone. Give them something to drink and hope for the best. That's all we can possibly do. So here's the yellow fever cures. Snake oil salesman. Hydrazone. Drink it, a cup, put a thing of this in your water and drink it every day. Snake oil salesman appeared everywhere, promising everything. This is bloodletting. Can you imagine that? Look at the size of that thing. It's like, no, man. I'll die. You know, you come near me with that thing, and they just pump the blood out. You can see this punch a hole, they just fill it up and take about a pint at a time. I love this. The noted Dr. Humbug cures all disorders incident with the human body. These are your snake oil salesmen. They'll promise anything for $1. And people were desperate. They would run. They would listen to anything. Laetrile. I don't know if you remember Laetrile. Well, that was supposedly a cure for cancer. That was from the apricot seed. It was found in Mexico. People flew down there and spent their entire life savings. It's the same thing. Last outbreak we had here was in 1905. First 2 people infected on Decatur Street. A nearby grocery store, the French Quarter, at that time was called Little Palermo because so many Sicilians had come in, they'd overrun the city, so to speak, that part, they'd taken it over. And that's where the yellow fever broke out. Sicilians were leery of doctors, anybody imposing rules because they had suffered so much discrimination. 5,000 people infected, 536 died. This is the first epidemic that takes place after Dr. Walter Reed, who we'll talk about in a second, does his research. For the first time now, they're starting to employ some of the ideas he came up with, limiting access to mosquitoes. And as a result, the numbers aren't as high, and the mortality rate is lower. The new mosquito doctrine. Board of Health comes in. Screened houses. Didn't have screens. Keeps the mosquitoes away. Covering cisterns. Y'all know what cisterns are? Some of y'all do. There's a big tank outside your house. The water ran off your roof, and that's where you got your water. You perish the thought nowadays. We talk about a boil water order. That was a boil water order on a regular basis. Oil in outhouses. Just taking some oil and dumping it in the outhouse so it puts an oil layer so the mosquito larvae can't get through it. These are the ideas. Flushing out the gutters. Actually cleaning the city. What a concept. Using mosquito nets over your beds at night. And when somebody is sick, quarantine them. Keep them isolated from everybody else so the disease doesn't spread. Mother Cabrini opens up a clinic in City Park. Archbishop Chappelle dies in this yellow fever epidemic on August 9th. War of waters between Mississippi and Louisiana. People in Mississippi didn't want anybody from Louisiana crossing the Pearl River getting to Mississippi. No. Stay there. Go away. Don't come into Mississippi. Post office refused to take the mail. Mail might be contaminated. They didn't know what was spreading it. However, the numbers infected were less than usual. And John Ellis, superintendent of Truro, said, "Isn't this striking proof of the mosquito theory? We've made these changes, and even though we have a disease, it's not nearly as bad as it's been in the past. Maybe they're on to something." Theodore Roosevelt, when he hears about the city outbreak and people are upset and angry about it, and they're talking about quarantining the city of New Orleans, he says, "I'm going there." He comes to New Orleans, walks around, eats dinner, visits with people, spends 9 days here and says, "Hey guys, everything's well in New Orleans," because he comes with the wake of the media following him. "See, y'all still alive? Yeah, good. You probably gained a pound. That's a good thing. The food's great. Everything's fine in New Orleans." Louisiana and New Orleans did what has never been done before in a similar epidemic. So they search for the cause. Carlos Finley. Carlos Finley is a Cuban doctor. Yellow fever's been running rampant in Cuba, and he's trying to figure out what's the vector. How does this disease spread? And he stumbles in 1881 on the prospect that it could be the mosquito. He goes to the International Sanitary Convention in Europe, expresses his ideas, his concerns. They listen to him, they think it's wonderful, and that's the end of it. Nobody pays any attention, as what happens often with scientists. For 20 years, his research is ignored. Then we get into the Spanish-American War. And American soldiers en masse are in Cuba, and they're dying of yellow fever. Something has to be done. So the military sets up the Yellow Fever Board. Jesse Lazier, together with Walter Reed, does that name ring a bell with you? Walter Reed Hospital in Washington. Aristas Agramant participated in a commission to try to determine yellow fever. They're sent down to the epicenter itself, Cuba. Doing a research at Camp Columbia, he confirms the hypotheses that Carlos Finley came up with. These are the gentlemen: Walter Reed, Carol, Jesse Lazier. This guy is a hero, an amazing man. Here's Dr. Walter Reed, who would end up dying of appendicitis some years later, which is kind of sad. This man, Jesse Lazier, he's the only one that had experience working with mosquitoes. He went to Finley's, because Finley was still around. He went to his lab because he wanted mosquitoes that he knew were uninfected. So anybody in the world of science understands you got to isolate that. So he gets these mosquitoes, and he sets up at Camp Columbia. He starts researching the mosquitoes, finding people who have yellow fever. They come down, he brings them in. He has the mosquitoes placed in test tubes. He has them bite the person. You can't do this in modern science. It puts you under the jail. He would then take the test tube and give it to somebody who's not infected to see if they get infected. Is it the mosquito? He's not having a whole lot of luck. And then he starts refining his research, writing meticulous notes, and suddenly he thinks, I may be on to something. So I'd rather think I'm on the track of the real germ. He writes to his wife. He deliberately allowed an infected mosquito, a special one, because now he thinks he understands the process. So he then takes this mosquito and follows the process he thinks what it is, allows the mosquito to bite him, and it kills him. He gets yellow fever. He goes into the toxic stage. He dies. Walter Reed, Aristides, the rest of these guys are absolutely devastated. He is the heart and soul of what they've been doing on the research level. Look at this. This is brutal. This is the telegram to his wife. Mrs. Lazier, Dr. Lazier died at 8 a.m. this morning. Imagine getting an email like that, you know, or how did he die? What are you talking about? This is how cold it was when they sent it to him. But what did he do? His experiment came up where he didn't know what the virus was, but he suspected there was something. Flavus meaning yellow. Large flower now includes West Nile. He took his mosquitoes, and by doing careful research, he figures it out. Now, after he's dead, you have the other surviving members of the commission go to his lab. And they said they felt like they were in a funeral parlor because all his papers were laid out, all his pens, cup of coffee, everything, because it just hit him suddenly. And they're mortified. They're broken. And Reed turns to him and he says, all right, we're going through his records. We're going through them carefully. So they go through the records, they read them and say, we can't find anything. Just read them again. So they go, all right. So they read all the records again. They still can't have anything. Then Reed says, read them aloud. And I want to listen. So as the guys are reading it aloud, all of a sudden, Reed looks up. He goes, that's it. That's it. And the other two doctors look at him and he said, what are you talking about? He says, keep reading, keep reading. And the second doctor, Aristides, comes up and goes, I see it, Walter. And the other guy says, all right, I wish you all would let me know what the hell y'all see because I don't have a clue what you're talking about. What it was, by meticulously going through the meticulous research that Jesse had done, they discovered that the mosquito had to bite someone that had gotten bitten within 3 days. Before 3 days, the mosquito's not going to carry it. After 3 days, the mosquito's not going to carry it. It's that little window of 3 days. Then the mosquito itself, after it was infected, had an incubation period of up to 12 days before the disease became to a point where it could be transmitted by the mosquito. That was the key. It wasn't just a mosquito, it was when it bit somebody and when it bit the second person. And that was the mechanism that was missing. That's what Jesse Lazier gave his life for, and that's what they discovered. All right, fine. Now we got this on paper. How do we prove it? These guys, soldiers, they volunteered. They set up a place called Camp Lazier in honor of Dr. Lazier. These guys volunteered, and they were offered $100 apiece to participate in the test. If you actually got yellow fever, you got $100 more. If you died, your family got the other 100. So it's So imagine asking people to volunteer for a test like this nowadays. Most of the guys wouldn't take the money. They said, no, I've lost friends to yellow fever. I'm willing to take, these are soldiers, I'm willing to take the chance. If you think you're on to something, I'm willing to work with you. So they said, okay. So they all signed a release form, which stipulated $100 and $100 if they got it, $100 if they died. And they all signed on, and then they came up with Camp Lazier. To determine the vector, was it fomites? Because the idea, was it really mosquitoes? So what are fomites? When people died of yellow fever, you saw the description was good. It was vomiting, it was bleeding, it was diarrhea, it was all of this. Their linens were soiled, their clothes were soiled, the bed sheets were soiled, everything, the mattresses were soiled. So what he did was, he set up Camp Lazier. Was it that? It could be a mosquito. How do I find out which it is? So they set up 2 buildings. One of them, he had the soldiers take a shower, strip down naked, go into the building, and put on the clothes of people who died. They said the stench was unbelievable with everything on it. They put the mattresses that the people died in, the sheets that the people died in, and they stayed locked in that little cabin for a week to 10 days. See what would happen. In the second building, they put a division up. I'll show you. This is a drawing to his wife from Walter Reed. In the second building, they had the doctors would sit here. They had 2 rooms, A and B. They put a partition between the 2. This room here had guys in it. No mosquitoes. Second room, they introduced mosquitoes following Jesse Lazier's research that they knew were infected. And they put them in there. And then they waited. And after they waited, this here is the one of fomites. It's this little bitty cabin in the heat of Cuba. And that's what the inside of the other one looked like. And they waited. Enterocide develops yellow fever in 4 days. Menticide remained well. Within 4 days, he came down with yellow fever. At which point, then they say, now we know. It's the mosquito. So, yellow fever was transmitted by mosquitoes. The transmission required a mosquito had fed on donors during the first 3 days following infection, and that an incubation period of several days must pass before the mosquito vector was capable of transmitting. They found out that number is 12 days. As a consequence of this, bulletins start going out, and this is why in 1905, this is 1900, this starts coming out, 1901, the epidemic in 1905 in New Orleans is the first time they start taking the research that Walter Reed had done, applied it to a city that was enduring an infection, eradicated the mosquitoes as best they could, and mitigated the infection. So here they are in New Orleans, spraying poisons and fumigating. Quarantine camp set up. If you got it, they put you in a little cabin, kept you away from everybody else. Now that it's known, what can you do about it? Response, 1900s, adopt sanitation laws. You got to close cisterns up, got to put screens on things, clean up water. We still hear about that, right, mosquito? Get rid of standing water, okay? Yellow fever vaccines were developed in 1930s. 17D vaccine in the French neurotropic disease. 1940s mass campaign using 17D in South America and French in vaccine in Africa. 1950s become concerned about encephalitis following vaccines given to infants. So now all of a sudden they're finding something wrong there, so they got to not give it to infants and hope infants don't get infected. 1960s, there's a large yellow fever outbreak in both South America and Africa. It is still with us. 1980s, a major increase of disease in Africa, 200,000 cases, 24,000 people died. You don't hear about that. You hear about Ebola, you hear about this exotic disease. Yellow fever is still here. In 2000, World Health Organization reports hundreds of yellow fever cases. Governments require proof of vaccination. So if you're traveling in Central America, you're traveling to Africa, more often than not, you've got to prove that you've been vaccinated. Yellow fever vaccine is safe, affordable. A single dose provides lifelong protection. And this gets into important to vaccinate 80% or more of a population to prevent transmission. That's the trouble we got with measles right now, right? We've gotten below that 80% level, so now it can spread. If you have 80%, you really can't spread. This is what the vaccine looks like. That's in the box. It's sold by the pharmaceutical companies. And this is a certificate you have to bear with you if you ever travel to Central America or South America to prove that you've been inoculated with vaccine. So conclusions, yellow fever has claimed the life of millions of people around the globe for a very long time. Slavery permitted the virus to escape from the interior of Africa. The mode of transmission was unknown. There is still no cure for it. Not until the research of Carlos Finley and Walter Reed in the 90s that mosquito was identified. The virus was not isolated until 1927. It's the very first virus ever documented as being identified. Max Sear of Rockefeller Institute developed the vaccine in 1936. 2013, 127,000 people got it, 45,000 died. And despite years of research, vaccines, yellow fever is still there is no cure. Thank you.
Quinn, thank you.
Well, we're going to do something different. We're not going to do any questions this time.
No questions?
No questions this time. What we're going to do is we're going to ask people in the audience if they'd like to say something to you and thank you for all you've done for us, for all the years we've been here. So anybody want to say something to Michelle?
Michelle, I'd just like to thank you for continuing what started all that time ago, but improving it greatly and making it just a wonderful community event that will persist now longer, I think, because of what you added to it. And only you could have done it. So thank you very much for that.
Anybody else have anything they'd like to say? No? Yes, okay. Michelle, I can tell you until you get there, I can't tell you how much I appreciate your love, your devotion, your energy, because it's been a tireless work on your part. And it's deeply appreciated by everybody associated with it. You're a very special person.
Michelle, there's a whole group of people who are tour guides that wound up coming out to Chalmette and to Nunez because of you. We all started coming because of all the wonderful lectures and all the information you gave us. And so really within the tour guide community, you're also known because of all the information you've provided us.
Does anybody else have anything? Well, in which case, I guess, if not, I'll open the floor. Does anybody have any questions for me? Yes, sir. Oh, yeah. Panama Canal is 1913. It was the reason it was started being dug by the French, and they failed because of yellow fever. But it was because of Walter Reed's research and the recognition of what the vector was that when they started the Panama Canal under the Roosevelt administration, they aggressively eradicated the mosquitoes in the area, able to dig the canal. But it's definitely tied. That's what stopped the canal from being dug on other occasions.
Anyone else?
You can find it on the Internet Archive, but there's a great, I guess, research that Dr. Fenner did. He published it in 1854, but in 1853 he tracked the cases, case one, and it was on the ship. And he has the dates of every case and whether or not there was an autopsy. But if you want some interesting reading, Dr. Fenner.
Yeah, you find the same thing. If anybody's interested in AIDS research, you have to read as the band played on, because that follows patient zero, the same thing. If one person gets it, it spreads everywhere. Yes, sir. Hey.
Hey, Mr. Ron. I was just wondering, when you were doing your research, did you come across anything that said how vulnerable we are to this happening again in this day and age? Did your research show anything?
No, I didn't, but I'm curious about that, simply because I'm just looking at the number of people coming from South and Central America where this disease is virulent. And nobody's checking them. In the old days, you used to check people to see if they had a disease before they came in. I think we're opening our door for a lot of vulnerability just from a health issue. We're letting politics get in the way of medicine and a lot of things. And I think that's a real problem. I mean, It's not a question of immigration. It's a question of, really, it is national security when you think about it, because the last thing you need is an outbreak. Because I don't think anybody here has ever had a vaccination for yellow fever. I haven't.
I did.
You have? If those of you have traveled someplace, you've got one.
You have to have it.
Oh, yeah, military. You get vaccinated for everything. But you know what? You can't get also smallpox vaccine. You can't get a vaccination for smallpox unless you're military. You know, I tried to get it for my daughter, and I was shocked I couldn't get smallpox, and that's brutal. They all had vaccinated? Yeah, you got to. Tina?
Thank you, Mr. Ron. I just want to say that you touched on a subject that's near and dear to me, and it literally scares the daylights out of me. For those of you who don't know, I used to teach microbiology. So I'll just comment on this. It ties into so much work that was done during that time of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch with Koch's postulates and trying to identify disease. Today, I know that the mosquitoes are kept in check simply through the life cycle. So what they've done to sort of mitigate this is a mosquito goes through 4 stages of egg, larva, pupa, adult, but the pupa can't fly. So the sprays that they spray out for the mosquitoes, it used to be, of course, that it started to affect the pelican population and whatnot because of the DDT. Now what they use is something that counteracts the hormone that stops it from aging, and it causes it to remain as a juvenile as opposed to going into an adult stage, so they can't fly, and therefore they can't transmit the disease.
Too, isn't it in Australia they're doing some genetic research where they're creating sterile males, I believe it is, and they're trying to overpopulate the population. But then, you know, that's based on the idea of eliminating a mosquito. We don't know where the mosquito fits in the food chain.
Correct.
You know?
Correct.
Sometimes you push like a balloon, you push here and something happens over here that you didn't expect.
So,
but you're right. Thank you for that.
So that's the 1 cent that I know on that, okay? That's the 1 cent. Thank you, because I learned so much. And I also wanted the mic tonight because I neglected to say something. If you're in here tonight, I mentioned about excellence in teaching. We have one of our nominees who's here for this year, Miss Lauren Franklin. Would you stand up, please?
That's Lauren.
Because she's a phenomenal faculty member, so if you get an opportunity, thank her for the work that she does with our students as well.
Beautiful woman with a PhD in chemistry. I mean, really? And a hunter. That's what I'm impressed with.
And someone that students compliment all the time about your teaching skills. So you should know that.
Just one question? Okay. After this, I'd like to give the floor to Renee Uzzi for a second.
Thank you to the shout out to my Unitarian predecessor, Reverend Theodore Clapp. An interesting side note about Theodore Clapp, his predecessor at the First Unitarian Church of New Orleans had died in a previous yellow fever epidemic because one year when the epidemic happened, Reverend Larned escaped the city. And when he came back, all his parishioners talked about him behind his back, that he was a coward, that he shouldn't have left the city. So he stayed the next time the epidemic happened, and it killed him. And that's what brought Parson Theodore Clapp to the city.
Yeah, he was an import, right.
One more, and we'll finish with this one.
I so enjoyed the presentation tonight. It was absolutely amazing. One of the things that I wanted to add a little bit is that I spent almost 20 years in Nigeria, right? And so I saw a lot of yellow fever. But what I didn't see was when the slave traders took the Africans from Africa, they didn't get the cure. They didn't get it. Now, I saw it said that the cure was in 1927. But I know from personal experience, when the women from the villages would go out and get a lot of leaves and herbs and different stuff that, of course, I'm an American, didn't know anything about, but I saw how they cured yellow fever because my children's father had yellow fever. And I saw that process. I saw how it worked. And when I was looking at your presentation, I realized that when the Europeans were infected, they failed to get the cures when they brought the Africans, and a lot of the Africans have immunities to it because they've been infected, so they had built up an immune system to it. And when they didn't have it, the Europeans that had gotten bitten and infected, in all actuality, they were the ones that really brought the yellow fever to America.
To the New World, right.
Instead of the Africans. I just want to
No, you're
that.
absolutely correct, because that was why even later on, it wasn't really, you didn't experience it too much in the local black population, because those the ones from Africa had immunity. Sometimes slaves who were born here didn't have the immunity, so they're the ones that would succumb. So great, but it's interesting, herbal medicine is something we know so little about. You know, we tend to dismiss it, and then we go into if you have a friend of mine who is a tropical medicine at Tulane, now we're going into the jungles and trying to find things that might cure things. It's like, the people who live there know this already. So for a moment, I'd like to give Renee Uzi an opportunity to come up if you'd like to say something. If you've read his book in the back, Yellow Fever, I read it, you can't put it down. It's a novel, but it's a great read, and it really captures the feeling of what it's like to be in the city with yellow fever and the politics associated with yellow fever. So Renee, by all means.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good evening, and thank you. Thank you for having me here today, Ron. I appreciate it. In 2003, I started to do a little research about Plaquemine Parish, which is where I lived, near the mouth of the river. I wanted to find out a little bit about Plaquemine because I always did like Louisiana history, and I wanted to add a little bit of this information. Whatever I found, I would add it to my coffee table, and many of my friends knew that I enjoyed history. So I went to the library and began reading and doing a little research about a piece of land that I owned in Plaquemine. And when I did, I realized that yellow fever, and of course Ron told you everything about it, and I can't tell you much more than what he did, but I was so intrigued by the yellow fever epidemics that struck New Orleans and that came through the Mississippi River and came through the mouth of the river. Living in Plaquemines, this was very interesting to me. And so I kept reading and reading about yellow fever, and I learned of the political and the economic and the social ramifications that occurred when this disease swept through the city of New Orleans, killing thousands every year, nearly year after year, as Ron pointed out. So although this is historical fiction, I did tens of thousands of hours of research, and I did it merely because I was having fun. I didn't expect to be here tonight. I didn't expect to have a book. I merely did it for fun. I found something that was interesting, and just like all of us have hobbies, this was my new hobby, which I started in 2003, and I took delivery in 2018. 15 years I worked on this, and simply because it was just fun. So the more I read about yellow fever in New Orleans, the more I learned about political corruption, if you can believe it, in New Orleans back in the day. Now, I didn't find anything specific that happened during the epidemic of 1853, but my story is about political corruption, which takes place in 1856. And there's a jump in my story to 2006. There's also political corruption that takes place then. Now, I set this corruption against the backdrop of the yellow fever epidemic, showing what the mayor of New Orleans, a very powerful man, and a shipping magnate in New Orleans, the Aristotle Onassis of the 1850s. That's how I saw him when I designed him. What would these guys do if they were adversaries? How would they take advantage of this crisis? People dying. What would they do to try to make money with this, which we see every day? I'm from New Orleans. I'm from Araby, actually. And just like everyone here, I've watched the news, read newspapers, and I've learned of political corruption nearly on every turn. And I just had an idea. I thought that I could put a story together. And that's basically what happened. So I started in 03, I ended in 18. Again, this is all a surprise to me. I wanted 3 copies, and an editor, she talked me into printing the book. I had no idea that this would be what Ron thinks, and I really value his opinion. When he told me several months ago how much he enjoyed the book, I was touched. Someone who's just so intelligent, I have so much respect for, and me, a proud graduate of the Chapman High School, and a hairdresser by trade for 41 years. So anyhow, that's how my story began, and that's kind of what it's about. Now, it started out as 8 pages, and I'll kind of end it here. I started out as 8 pages, and after the 8 pages, I decided to add a character. Well, then if I added a character, he had to ask a question or say something, and then someone had to respond. So I had to add a second character. That person responded, they knew someone, they knew something, they knew a politician, and today it's 570 pages. Had I worked on it day in and day out, it probably would have taken 4 or 5 years, but we've all been through things, and so have I, and so it took a little while. I have no regrets, had a great time. I appreciate my time here. Thank you, Ron, and thank you.